Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to get started. We have a pretty tight 2-hour event schedule. So officially welcome to our first of two 2021 CFE ARLI Policy Forum events. I'm Sarah Hoppy Knight, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the co-executive director of the Chicago Foundation for Education, CFE, and the manager of programs. And I'm very delighted to have all of you with us this evening. For those of you new to CFE, we're a Chicago-based education nonprofit that's been in existence for more than 35 years, supporting and funding CPS educators so they can best serve their students and grow meaningfully in their profession. At CFE, we uplift and empower CPS pre-K through 12th grade educators and their work in an effort to support equitable and just student experiences. We value the importance of self-examination and the power of self-reflection to drive action, and know how important both are when educating Chicago's diverse student population. Many thanks again to all of you for being here tonight to support 4 of our reflective, thoughtful fellows. So a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. Throughout the course tonight, we have 4 presentations, and there are 2 ways that you can ask a question. So most of you are probably familiar with this format or something similar. So you can send a question during the presentations to Kate Carter via the chat box. So she actually has changed her name to Q&A moderator, Kate Carter. So you're welcome to send her a question, a written question via the chat box during the presentations, or you can ask a question during the Q&A period that will follow each of the 4 presentations via the raise your hand function. So if you have any trouble with that, you can always private chat me too, or you can private chat Kayla, who's my program associate, and we will help you through that. And then one other thing that we ask you to do at the end of every presentation is to complete a feedback form. So for a lot of our presenters, if not all of them, this is the first time that they're presenting this particular set of data, this research, their findings, their policy recommendations to a group. And feedback, constructive feedback is really, really helpful. So if you can do one of those, we'll pop that link in the chat box after every presentation, so you'll have easy access to that form. So tonight we are showcasing 4 of our 9 ARLI fellows. We hope you enjoy their inspiring accounts of student research and discovery. Before we move into the presentations, however, I'd like to hand it off to Deb Moretsky, who has fearlessly led this cohort during a very unconventional and challenging school year. So thank you, Deb, and I will hand it off to you.
All right, well, thank you, Sarah, and hello to everybody whose faces I can't see out there. I want to make this brief because we've got good stuff to share with you. I took over after 17 years of Sue Hansen being the advisor for ARLI. I hope she's in the audience tonight. So I hope that our work tonight does justice to what she built over those 17 years. We have 9 fellows who indeed had quite a year. It's a rather grueling process to begin with. It's a tough application process to get through and to get accepted. And then there's a lot of work during a school year where people are working at full-time anyway as classroom teachers. This year we happen to meet every 2 weeks on Zoom. So there was a lot of getting to know each other, a lot of work that was going on, and I am so pleased to be able to tell you that these 9 fellows worked incredibly hard, did important work, and have wonderful things to share with you. And I'm excited to see their final product tonight too. So we're all really very proud of the work that they did. Another person that I really want to thank and I want to introduce you to is Kate Carter, whose face I don't see right now, but she is someone who was an ARLI fellow for 2 years, a fellow and a senior fellow. And she agreed to stay on this year to kind of help me transition into this new position during this kind of crazy year. And she has been invaluable to me and to the fellows in terms of helping all of us through a learning process that we were all going through this year in terms of what we were called to do for ARLI. So Kate's out there somewhere. I don't know if she needs to, does she need to speak right now, or is she just gonna come in with the question and answer? Or should I just go ahead and introduce Andy?
You can do that, or Kate can. Either one is fine.
I don't know where she is.
Hi, I'm here.
There you
Just
go.
super briefly, it's a huge honor to get to be involved with the Action Research Leadership Institute for my 4th year. Every year feels like it's a little bit different, but this year felt more different than most. So huge shout out to all of the teachers, and a fantastically huge shout out to Deb for her work in kind of the first year of doing this in such an unprecedented time. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Kate. So I have the pleasure of introducing the first fellow to present tonight. This is Andy DeVivo. He is a 4th grade science teacher from Tarkington School of Excellence. And he's going to have a lot more to say about this, but briefly, he wanted to take a look at what encouraging socioeconomic kinds of skills in the classroom might do in order to help his students become more involved and engaged scientists. And I can tell you that I think he found that what he tried worked pretty well, and he has some wonderful results to share with you. And so Andy's going to open us up tonight.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Sarah. Let me pull up my presentation. Hopefully that is looking okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Andy DeVivo. As Deb said, I'm a 4th grade bilingual math and science teacher at Tarkington School of Excellence in the Marquette Park neighborhood. And I'm grateful to be here today to talk with you about my research and what's truly been a unique year of teaching and learning. So I'd like to begin, if you feel comfortable, to ask you to close your eyes and take 3 deep breaths with me. And as you breathe in, I'd like you to think about how you're feeling in this moment. And as you breathe out, I'd like you to accept that feeling and simply acknowledge it as how you're feeling right now. So breathing in and out, breathing in and out, breathing in and out. I will admit that my feeling is a little bit of nervousness, but thank you for joining me in that. Now, the title of my presentation is Social Emotional Science. And the title speaks to the 2 parts of my research. The first, you just experienced a little bit of as you began to become aware of the feelings that you have in this moment. We'll come back to that part shortly. The second part, the science part, I'd like to explore more now. As I mentioned, I teach 4th grade math and science. And for this reason, I'm going to invite you to think back to when you were an elementary school student in 4th grade. Do you remember a science lesson that you participated in? I remember very vividly learning about the word buoyancy because it was one of the first C's that I got in science class. I remember that we read a book about buoyancy and learned that it was when an object has the ability to float in water. And then later, my teacher invited us to take empty milk cartons and put them in water and watch them float. See, she said, just like we read about, that's buoyancy. At that moment, it seemed like science was something that you just did to confirm what someone else had already written about or discovered. Someone else had already figured it out. We just had to read it and learn it and memorize it. And well, I'll tell you, I do know still what buoyancy is. But I will say that I never had an inkling to be a scientist, and I didn't feel a great passion for discovering something new as an elementary school student. And as an elementary school teacher, that's all I want for my students. Now, about 10 years ago, science educators and experts realized that they also want students to fall in love with science and maybe one day become scientists. And the current way of teaching just wasn't doing that. And so they released a new framework for K-12 science education that will go on to influence a new collection of standards that myself and other science educators are trying to implement to this day. And these new standards had important changes for the way that science was taught and learned, which is different from how when I learned science, or maybe when you learned science. I'll mention a few of those changes that were important to my research. The first is that science moves away from memorization of facts and teacher-led instruction and into student discovery and discussion. The second was the inclusion of something called science and engineering practices, which really allowed students to do the same practices that real scientists do out in the field when they conduct their research and investigations. And the third was learning science by doing science. In what's called an inquiry-based approach, students would discover and make sense of things they were seeing, make connections and synthesize information, and then learn how what they found connects to what real scientists have done in the past. Now, I will say that this particular way of learning is difficult for students. While it's, I think, best practice, a lot of students find difficulty feeling comfortable enough to take risks and share ideas that are different from their peers. They have a little bit of trouble connecting ideas as they learn something from one activity and another activity in their inquiry-based approach. And they have a little bit of trouble using multiple science and engineering practices together. For example, they might make observations in a particular activity and then use those observations to create some sort of model that would allow them to explain what they were learning. I also would be remiss not to share that I find this approach to teaching difficult. I think sometimes I try to over-support my students. I'm scared that that first answer they give me will never eventually turn into the right answer as they discover more and more in different science activities. The more that I feel like I have to scaffold, the more I take away also their opportunity to develop their own scientific identity, which is something that I struggled with when I was a student. And I also struggled taking my voice out of the discussion and watching them stumble, even though I know that when they're stumbling, that's the moment that they're learning the science. Now, these struggles for my students and myself were on my mind last year when I was taking a professional development on how to implement social emotional learning in the classroom. Knowing that this particular year when students were at home learning in the middle of a pandemic was going to be very difficult for them, I wanted to get more information on what social emotional learning was and how I could use it in the classroom to support my students personally. If you're unfamiliar with what social emotional learning is, it's sometimes called SEL. It's a process that helps young people and adults acquire skills and knowledge to help them to develop their identity, manage their emotions, achieve their goals, develop empathy, establish positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. Sometimes you learn this at home, at summer camp, at daycare, and sometimes at school. Now, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning has identified these 5 areas in the middle as capacities that students can develop if they're provided opportunities within the classroom or in another setting. Now, during this professional development, as I was going through activities like the one I led you through at the start of this presentation with the breathing, I started to realize that maybe social emotional learning would not only help my students personally, but it may also help them with this difficult science learning approach called inquiry-based science instruction. And it's to that end that I decided to focus my research this year on these 2 pieces, the social emotional piece and the science piece. And so the question I was investigating is what happens to students' ability to engage in science and engineering practices within a science curriculum when I make room for them to develop those social emotional competencies during science time. So not only during any part of the day, but specifically during the science instruction time. Now, 3 of the competencies that I found particularly interesting for inquiry-based instruction were self-awareness, self-management, and relationship skills. And this year, I provided students with opportunities to develop those 3 competencies using supplemental activities to the science curriculum. I'd like to share a little bit about those activities right now. So the first is self-awareness, and this is exactly what we did at the beginning of the presentation. And it's really our ability to understand our emotions and our thoughts and our values, our ability to establish an identity, even a learner identity. And so each day at the start of science class, which was about 2 hours into the actual learning day, I would ask students to pause and breathe, take 3 deep breaths with me, and share an emotion of how they are at that moment. Not every student was comfortable sharing with the microphone, but as you can see here on the right side of your screen, they were comfortable sharing in the chat. Students would say they were excited or calm, happy, not stressing, sometimes even tired, sleepy, frustrated, sad, but they were able to take that emotion and get it out of their body and into some sort of expression. And that was all that I asked them to do with their self-awareness. Self-management, which was the next competency that we worked on, is really our ability to manage those emotions, those thoughts and behaviors, and really become aware of the goals that we have and to help us achieve those goals. Now, this was a competency that students had a lot of practice with during the actual science instructional time through the use of a digital notebook. But I also saw a need for them to develop some organizational skills in a low stakes way as well. And so early in the science unit, I would give them opportunities like this to create their own organizational strategy. As you can see on the left side of the screen, this is what students were given during the start of the activity. And they'd have about 5 minutes to make sense of what they saw and to move the Post-it notes around in a way that created some sort of understanding of what the Post-its were showing. So the student on the right, yes.
Andy, excuse me. I just wanted to confirm we were not seeing anything before the Post-its that you just moved to. Just wanted to make sure we hadn't missed any images prior.
You couldn't see the Post-it notes, you're saying?
We were on the K-Sol circle until just now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, for some reason that did not move forward. Okay, good to know. So you did not see this screen?
No.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. So if you remember me talking about the self-awareness piece, this is what I was talking about when I was mentioning that students were able to express their emotions and were able to share with how they were feeling that day. And so here you can see on the right side, the chat where students were putting those emotions and really able to getting them out of their system, out of their body before we moved into the next part of science class. So can I confirm that that slide moved? Okay, all right.
You're great.
Thank you. So now the self-management piece, again, here you can see that on the left side are the Post-it notes that students were given. And so they had about 5 minutes to just look at those Post-it notes and say, hey, what is going on here? Ulysses was able to say, okay, I see that the green ones are all talking about vegetables and the blue ones are talking about cookies. So he was able to change the colors of the Post-it notes to make sense of what he was seeing. And in this moment, he was really creating or starting to create his own understanding of an organizational strategy, which is something that he'll have to use later on as he's in the middle of science, using those science and engineering practices. Still moving, okay. And then the last competency that we had was relationship skills. And that's really our ability to both establish and maintain those relationships with friends, teachers, acquaintances, and all those that we come in contact with. So in order to help students develop those relationship skills, they were constantly working in groups in math and science, but I also had them do some more low stakes opportunities like the one on the previous slide. And here they're just taking a bunch of different squares really and making a puzzle out of them. So they have about 20 minutes to work with their group, all virtually, to create a picture from what they can see. And so it allows them to have to communicate effectively, have to say, hey, you're in charge of this piece, you're in charge of that piece, and begin to develop those relationship skills, even though they were virtually learning. It was a very difficult competency to work with them this year because we were never physically in the same space. And so I would say that this was definitely the hardest one to do, but as you can see from this particular group at the bottom, they were able to achieve their goal after about 20 minutes, which is great. Now, students were doing all of this, these developments of the social emotional competencies while they were also learning science. And the science that we were investigating was this question of why is an increase in light affecting the health of tokay geckos in a Philippine rainforest? This particular question was helping students to understand the structure and function of different structures that animals have within their body and how they use those structures to help them survive. So like real basic, we have eyes, our eyes have parts, and those parts help us to see danger and find food and find shelter. But they were learning that on a little more sophisticated level. Now, I just want to briefly touch on what the structure of the curriculum was like, because it helped me to support them in their social emotional capacities and their science capacities. The unit question, as I just mentioned, was supported by 4 chapter questions, and each chapter had its own investigation question with it. Students were usually able to answer the investigation question after they participated in 3 or 4 activities and learned some sort of science idea. This is different than how maybe when you and I learned science, when we really were learning a whole concept in one day. Like I learned buoyancy in one day because it was told to me, and I observed it. Now it's taking students 2 or 3 different activities and maybe about a week of learning before they can really understand a science idea. So here's an example of that. They may make observations in one activity, use a digital model to understand something they can't see in the real world in a second activity, and then obtain more information from a book in a third activity. They have to put all those activities together to help them to answer this investigation question, which is, which is really a complicated skill, and it really requires a lot of self-management and organization. So to help them with that, I gave them a self-management opportunity, which is called a digital notebook. So because they were synthesizing information over maybe 2 weeks of learning, I decided to give them first in chapter 1 a supportive notebook that gave them spaces for them to write what they were learning in pink, and then spaces to synthesize in green to make connections between the activities and the question they were trying to investigate. In chapter 2, I took those scaffolds totally away. And maybe it was a little too soon, because in chapter 3, I had to bring them back. I realized that even though I wanted them to take ownership over their notebook, they really weren't ready. And so I tried to give them a little bit more support. And then in chapter 3, later on, and chapter 4, I again took those scaffolds away. And so what happened in chapter 4 at the end was that 18 out of 20 students were able to create their own investigation, or their own organizational style that's different from the one that I provided to them. This is showing their ability to build that capacity of self-management. So they changed the shape, they changed the color, they changed where they put different notes, and really showing that they have ownership over that notebook. One particular student really took that to a new level. So she took her notebook from this to this. And so she was able to totally change the way that even I had structured it for them at the very beginning, and show that she had complete command over that self-management. Here she was writing her observations, and here she was doing her synthesizing and making connections between the different things that she was learning. And that enabled her later on to answer that question that's right in the middle that says, why do different animals need different amounts of light to see well? She had all of her information that she needed and could provide the evidence to help her. Another capacity that we were working on was relationship skills. And it was, as I mentioned, particularly difficult. But one particular practice within science that lends itself to that is group modeling. So group modeling is really just students working together to create an explanation with a picture and words that explains a science concept. Here you can see that groups 1 and 3 on the left side of your screen were able to make pretty sophisticated models based on their evidence, while groups 2 and 4 had a little bit more difficulty. What's interesting here is groups 2 and 4 both had students who were successful individually in their model building. But when they had to work with the group, they found it much more difficult to be successful. One of the reasons this is, I think, is because groups 1 and 3 asked nearly 20 more clarifying questions to each other to help them work together. So for example, these questions would be something like, why did you draw the arrows of light going that way? What do you mean there's too much light for the gecko to see? Who's going to write this part of the explanation? This leads me to believe that teaching students to question each other, and it's okay to question each other, really helps them to be more successful in group work and also more successful with the science and engineering practices. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the more challenging pieces for science right now is using these science and engineering practices in an effective way. Now, this is an example of students using their notebook to do one science practice, and that's obtaining information. Here you can see that Cassandra was able to obtain information from 2 different sources and then use that self-management to synthesize it together and to create an explanation of what she was learning from those 2 activities. So she writes that this means that all these parts in the eye work together to help us see the light and get information on what we are seeing. Abel had a little more trouble in that he was able to successfully obtain information from one source, but was not able to get information from that second source that would help him to answer the question. Now, as you can see, I labeled him as progressing because he's not failing at this. He's clearly successful in one activity, but not in the other. And what the digital notebook allows me to do is see exactly where he's successful and exactly where I can support him as a teacher. So that self-management piece not only helps him, but it helps me as an educator support him in what he needs. Another practice is engaging in argument from evidence. And it's one of the most challenging practices because it asks students to take all that information and put it together and answer that end of chapter question. Typically in the past, students had not much success because they would forget all the activities they learned from the past weeks. And so they weren't able to take that information and use it as evidence. This year, because of their ability to work with the notebook, nearly 3/4 of students were successful with this practice. And why is self-management important? Here you can see Emiliano's notebook, where he uses his notebook and the pieces from it to support in his explanation. The green arrows are what I drew to show where the parts from his explanation come from and how he used that information he collected in his explanation to be successful in this practice. And finally, we have using multiple practices. And this is students' ability to take multiple practices and use them at the same time. Here, students are using the obtaining information, and they're using that information to create a model that explains what they are learning. Allison was progressing here because she was struggling with one of the practices, and then it did not allow her to be successful with the second practice, which really, again, shows how I can support her as a teacher. I know what she's not successful in, and that will allow me to support her there so she can be successful in the next practice as well. Zoe, on the other hand, was able to take all the parts of her that she was learning from her notebook and use them while she was working on her second practice, which was developing her model. So here you can see all of the green text showing what she was successful with. And then she was able to do her model below because she had all of that information collected and organized in an effective way. So in the end, what happens when students can get support with their social emotional practices and then engage in the science and engineering practices? Generally, nearly 3/4 of my students were successful with using one of the science practices, while in years past, this would have been less than half. With multiple practices, again, nearly 3/4 of students were successful with using multiple practices, while in years past, it would have been less than half. What else happened? Students became more self-aware. They were comfortable sharing with how they were feeling at all points of the class. One reflection I had in February was they would come in the class and just immediately share with me, I'm feeling this and this and this. And again, that allowed me as a teacher to support them, not only in science class, but also in all moments of the class that they were with me. And finally, they were able to establish their own identities within the science practices. In some of our models, we have our students' favorite things. Here's Angel's Pikachu, Gael's TV show, and Maylin's hamster, all finding their way within the science and engineering practices. And so I'd recommend to teachers to allow students spaces to reflect and to help them build their self-management practices. In schools, find curriculums where curriculums are integrating social emotional learning into the academics. And nationally, we need to prioritize students' well-being above test scores. And again, find curriculum that includes social emotional learning. It helped my students become better at science and engineering practices. And I think it will help all students in all academic areas. Thank you.
I think I speak for everyone when I go, woo! Andy, you have a lot of thumbs up and applause emojis in the quiet audience. So at this time, we would like to turn the floor over to questions from our audience members. I would also like to point out that in the chat, you have a feedback form for Andy. This both gives him a chance to hear your further questions and compliments and is really helpful and wonderful for ARLI presenters to get. So please complete that feedback form for Andy and also use the chat option. If you would like to post any questions in the chat, I will speak those out to the group, or you can use the raise hand function if you would like to verbally ask your question. So what questions or comments do we have for Andy at this time? All right, I have a question from one of our great ARLI supporters, Sue Hansen, which is next year when hopefully you are face to face with students. what do you plan to continue doing based on this project? Are there some things that you're interested in changing, and are there any things that you think you'll drop?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the great things about this year, if there's anything that's great, is there's the ability of using technology in a much higher way for students. So I think I will use the digital notebooks next year, even though we'll be virtual or in person, because it allows students to be really organized, that allow them to be successful. But I'm also looking forward to incorporating more just like group activities and just being able to allow students to work with each other in person. I think that will help the relationship skills that were more difficult to develop this year.
Thank you. What other questions do you have for Andy? You can definitely unmute, raise hand if you're also interested in asking out loud. We have a question from Keisha. How did you develop the students' questioning skills? And did you share with students that questioning leads to greater understanding? So to what extent were you explicit about that with the fourth graders?
Yeah, I think it's something that I mentioned briefly, that it's just a norm in our classroom. It's something that we start at the very beginning of the year and then continue on to use in math and science every day. And so we do a lot of low stakes activities where they're just asking questions back and forth at the very beginning of the year. And that just translated itself into science for some groups. But again, I think I'm curious how that will work in person, because with the mute function of Google Meets, it's interesting that students can kind of hide behind the camera off and the mute and not question as much. And so I'm curious to again, bring that more out in the in-person learning.
We have a question from one of our former fellows, Miriam Gonzalez. She asked, were there any challenges in integrating the SEL component of science during your science time? Did you do this with all of your groups of students? And what did that look like?
Yeah, I'm blessed that my school really safeguards science for elementary students. That's something that is not typically done. So I have about 50 minutes of science time every day for my students. And so I'm able to use 10 minutes of that for SEL, which I think was worth it. I think it's more difficult when there's only 30 minutes of science time to give a third of that to SEL for sure. But yes, I did it with both my classes, but only focused on one for the data. And it just made a difference in the entire environment of the class, from math to science, just giving them the opportunity to be self-aware and be reflective and manage their own learning.
Well, Andy, I know this makes me want to go back and do science again in elementary school. I don't remember any questions that we were asked in our fourth grade science class. I feel like that started for me in fifth grade, so thank you. At this time, after we give Andy another round of props, applause, in whatever way we will, we are going to stay in the science world, but we're going to move up the grades a little bit. And we are going to move on to our next presenter of the evening. Andrea Pulido is going to talk to us about her experience working with high school students in science, and see if you notice any connections between the work of these two presenters.
Appreciate that introduction. Let me share my screen with all of you. Oh. All right. Can you guys see my screen? All right, perfect. Thank you. Great evening, everyone. I am excited to be here with you today to talk about my research project, In Your Eyes, the importance of culturally responsive practices in a science classroom. So before we dive into my research question, I want to provide you with some context as to how I approached my action research experience. So I am a fifth year teacher who is a Chicago Public School alumna. Throughout the majority of my life, I often thought of compliance as a way to render respect. So growing up, I didn't really question my teachers or my parents, and I basically did what I was told. When I arrived at Farragut, I quickly learned that not all students were like me. Farragut is a high school located in the Little Village and North Lawndale community. 97% of our students come from low-income families. 87% of our students are Latino, 11.3% of our students are Black, and 1.8% of our student population are white. Our students are quite vocal, and they have no problem letting me know when they find something boring or even give me pushback. Before, I wondered if this meant students were disrespecting me or undermining my authority, but I quickly came to admire the bravery of students to question the adults around them, because this was something that I never truly did. And so I wanted to hear more from students, and I was not the only one. Adults in our building are committed to searching for new and creative ways to engage students and make all students feel safe and welcomed. With the support and guidance from our administration team, our school has been on a journey to create a more equitable environment. This year, for example, teachers and faculty have participated in professional learning communities around equity, where we have discussed our own cultural identities and created a safe space to confront and address biases. We have also made time to collaborate and talk to each other as we encounter the extra obstacle of remote learning and hybrid learning now. And so I knew that all of these important factors were going to contribute to how students experience our biology class this year. And so, like every year, in the beginning of September, I asked students to complete a survey so that I can get a baseline for their general interest and priorities. While I asked students a variety of questions, their response to a fill-in-the-blank question struck me the most. The question was presented as follows: I hope that in this biology class, I will be able to blank. Students did not get a word bank, so all of these answers students developed themselves. After looking at students' responses, I was able to separate them into 4 main categories. I identified and coded these groups as novelty, or students' interest in learning something new, social emotional learning, personal or specific content interest, and performance and grades. These responses let me know that as I taught students and introduced them to new content, it had to be interesting enough to capture their interest. I also had to provide students with space to collaborate with one another and build relationships, while also keeping in mind that students really care about their grades. And so this led me to develop my research question: what happens when I integrate culturally sensitive and culturally responsive practices into my science curriculum? And so before I could even think about implementation, I had to better understand what culturally responsive classrooms even looked like. And so after some investigating, I was able to find that in culturally responsive classrooms, teachers have high expectations for all students. They eliminate activities and problems that involve one correct response. Culturally responsive classrooms also remove the sense of urgency and make the commitment to bring in students' experiences. Additionally, they provide the space and time for students to interact and collaborate with one another, and for students to practice self-efficacy. In addition to some of the components already mentioned, researchers found that culturally responsive biology classrooms also engage students in hands-on learning. They view culture as an asset to content learning. And in these classrooms, teachers are quite explicit about cultural competence. My game plan was to integrate components of culturally responsive classrooms into my curriculum. I was going to look at 5 different projects specifically, but for the purpose of this presentation, I will focus on 3 of those. All of these projects carry key components of culturally responsive classrooms that I have here highlighted in green. All right, so now that I determined what I was going to do, I had to figure out how I was going to collect my data. And so since I was interested in student voice, surveys were a no-brainer. Surveys were given to students at least once each quarter via Google Forms. Students were given time in class to complete these surveys. I was also interested in comparing student work from 5 main projects. And so I accepted their work via Google Classrooms, where they uploaded videos, Google Slides, or Jamboards. I also started to conduct some student interviews, though for the sake of time throughout my year, this quickly turned into quick one-on-ones in breakout rooms during class. And lastly, I used my observations from small group and whole group discussions when completing or as I moved through my research project. I wanted to take a closer look at how the integration of culturally responsive classrooms impacted different student groups. And so for this reason, I used 10 students from each of my classes. These were in randomly selected students, rather they were quite targeted. I wanted to make sure that my sample students varied in their academic performance. I made sure to include both Latino and Black students. I also made sure to include students with individual learning plans or IEPs and students identified as English language learners. I also attempted to select students who had some sort of consistency with their attendance for the sake of my data collection. As I wondered if my findings would be the same throughout my 5 cohorts, I developed 3 sub-questions. How do students perform in NGSS practices of science and engineering when they have culturally relevant opportunities to engage with biology? What will happen to student engagement when lessons are connected to their community? How do my teaching strategies evolve to engage students? And so I had created a game plan. And the first project we were looking at was the photosynthesis project, in which students were asked to provide their initial thoughts to the question, where does a plant's mass come from? They were then asked to give a final verdict of the same question after we had gone through the unit's labs and activities. This project allowed students to practice self-efficacy as I gave students the power to shape their learning and experience. They had the ability to deliver their knowledge in the way they deemed best, whether it be a video, poem, Google Slides, presentation, etc. They also had the opportunity to work individually or in groups. Students were given a variety of supports like graphic organizers to help them construct their final verdicts. Students' work was analyzed and graded using a 3-point scale, where a 3 showed that students offered a response with a robust explanation, a 2 showed that students' explanations were beginning to offer an explanation, and a 1 reflected that students gave a response with little or no explanation. The same system was used for the verdict. And so here we have an example of a 3. It comes from one of my group's children's book. And in this page, you see the bees discussing how the sun breaks down the chemical bonds in water and carbon dioxide molecules, which allows the free carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms to rearrange themselves and form glucose. The group of students concluded that since carbon atoms form the carbon dioxide, which used to form the glucose, that the majority of a plant's mass came from carbon dioxide. You will notice that the responses for a 2 and a 1 offer less details and explanations than the story pages I just presented. I also monitored how creative students' projects were with their projects. And so a 3 showed that students came up with something completely different, like a rap or a poem. A 2 showed that students simply presented some Google Slides, like my teacher example did. And a 1 reflected that students failed to complete the project and completed an alternative assignment instead. And so here I have a 3 as an example of that last category. We're just gonna see a small clip it.
Back up in the booth talking about photosynthesis. Miss Lilito told me do photosynthesis. I'm trying to get my work done, but I'm stuck doing this. It's a funny show, but let's get up into this photosynthesis. You know that trees and plants can't make their own food. If you didn't know that, homeboy, I guess you a fool. But animals can't. Plants are like animals. Plus, out the sunlight transferring energy. Plants take water and sun take CO2 to make glucose, sugar that they use for food. Hey. They also put oxygen into the air we can share because the oxygen is everywhere. The energy transforms from solar to chemicals all the time, maybe with a passage of idea in every plant, in every tree, in every land, all living things be.
All right, I know you were probably jamming to that, but for the sake of time, we'll be moving on. Well, I coded students' work and created the following graphs to present my findings. I will be using a similar setup for the majority of my graphs, where in the x-axis, I have the different components of the project, while my y-axis represents the number of students. The different colors represent the scores that students got for each section. The blue shows a 3, the orange shows a score of a 2, the gray shows a 1, and the yellow shows a missing. And so the graphs were also broken down by cohorts. The first thing that I noticed and that caught my attention was that the yellow was only present for 2 out of my 5 cohorts. This revealed that missing projects or components came from my regular and co-tac classes, which happened to be my first and second period classes. I wonder that if the time of the day impacted students' ability to complete the projects, as they were often tardy or late to their earlier classes versus their later classes. I also noticed how my COTAT and ELL cohorts had more students receiving once in their initial thoughts compared to the other cohorts. My honors and ELL cohorts had more students receiving once in their verdicts compared to other cohorts. 40% of my ELL sample students turned in an alternative assignment. This meant that they had failed to turn in the project, and I reached out to them, met with them, and discussed the option of completing an alternative assignment, which they did. I wondered why they had not done the project itself in the first place, even though they had the knowledge to complete successfully the alternative assignment. And so I wondered if some of these students would have benefited from more direct instructions, like complete a Google Slides or do a poem, rather than giving them full control. Though sample students from my ELL cohort were not performing far from other cohorts, they still appeared to be the group that needed the most support. I wondered why. The language support was being offered, this content was hard, and the vocabulary is challenging for English and non-English speakers alike. Perhaps students found less value in this content, so I wondered how I could engage them more. I was surprised to see that there were so few students getting 3 with their initial thoughts, especially in my 7th period COTAT class and my ELL class. Even my honor cohort had low numbers in this section, and I wondered why. Did students not find value in sharing their thoughts? Was a stronger connection needed between the content and the students in order for them to authentically share their interests and thoughts? In this COVID-19 project, all students worked in groups and submitted their responses via a Padlet, which is an educational platform that serves as a virtual bulletin board. This project not only connected real life events in real time, but also highlighted cultural competence as it recognized the current struggles of certain groups and communities. It also provided students with the space to process how COVID-19 was affecting them and their families. For this project, students were to research the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths in a given zip code. Students were given a live map from the Chicago Sun-Times to help them with the task. Students were also to explore the racial and ethnic background in those neighborhoods before discussing and responding to the question, does race or household income impact the rate of COVID-19 cases in Chicago neighborhoods? And so automatically, I noticed major differences between responses. Some students gave responses with a reason but no explanation. Some responses offered some explanation. Some groups gave explanations using data, like the percentage of people who received COVID or the number of deaths due to COVID. Some responses explained their reasoning using lived experiences. Very few groups responded using data and their lived experiences. And so I used these descriptors to code students' responses overall. I placed the different coding categories in the x-axis and kept the number of the students as the y-axis. I again separated the cohort responses to see if there were any notable differences among my different group of students. This time around, there was no missing responses, and I wonder if this was attributed to the fact that students worked in groups. The good news was that most groups included a response using either data or their lived experiences. However, the big question was, why was it one or the other? Only the honors cohort had more than one group that included both numerical data from their research and their lived experiences. Overall, students were explaining and elaborating on their responses more than last time, which demonstrated a deeper level of understanding. However, students were rarely using both data and their lived experiences to support their responses. This made me reflect, was I placing the same value on data and student experiences throughout my lessons? Was I giving their experiences explicit value, space, and points, and rubrics and grades? And so in this last project we will be looking at, this was the Conditions and Disease project, in which students had the option of working with a group or by themselves to create a poster or infographic on a disease or condition of their choice. Students were to include a claim of who is more likely to develop this disease or condition, provide supporting evidence, and discuss a connection between themselves and the disease. Students were invited to explore diseases or conditions found in their families, and I discussed my brother's own journey with ulcerative colitis. I did emphasize that students did not have to share anything they felt uncomfortable about. I explained how a connection could also be if the disease is more likely to occur with people of their own race, age group, or gender. Students were also given a number of supports like a graphic organizer and helpful links. I used the same 3-point scale where a 3 would mean the claim, evidence, and personal connections were strongly developed. A 2 meant they were partially developed, and a 1 meant that they were at the beginning stages of being developed. And so here I have 2 student samples. On the left, you're able to see a project from one of my EL students. Her project covered diabetes, and she described how both her parents had diabetes and compared the treatment of her dad, who takes insulin, to that of her mom, who takes metformin and anti-diabetic medication. She received a 3 on the personal connection. On the right, we see another project coming from a different student. Here, I am highlighting her claim that men are more likely to develop diabetes than women. She used data from the CDC, which describes the prevalence of diabetes by sex. She received a 3 on her claim and evidence. Here I have another example of a student who wrote about how she suffers from vitamin D deficiency. And so when I analyzed this data, I noticed that the honors cohort wrote some stronger claims, but they were not really well ahead than of other classes, right? And so this was really exciting to me because it reminded me that all students, regardless of whether they were in honors or not, could succeed when they were engaged and when high expectations were in place. 40% of our sample students in the regular and co-taught classes did not include evidence, which made it really difficult to see if students were having a hard time with providing evidence or if they ran out of time. And when I asked students, they usually said they ran out of time, but we all know that students don't always own up to being confused. I was really happy to see that at least 60% of sample students in all classes provided strong personal connections. And so from the first project in early November to this one in mid-March, students appeared to improve. Their claims were beginning to develop and their personal connections increased. All cohorts had students with missing components this time around, but this could have been attributed to the third quarter slump, and March was also a very emotional time around our community. And so last week, I gave students an end of the year survey where I asked them to rank the order of importance of the 4 categories I had identified earlier: novelty, social emotional learning, personal and specific interest, and grade and performance. After having moved from heavy science projects like the photosynthesis project to, well, still heavy science projects, but now with space for student voice to come in, I was confident that students would rank personal interest or maybe social emotional connections as the elements they valued most in our class. Nope, not a chance. Whether we like it or not, students have placed a huge emphasis on grades, and grades matter, not only for the obvious reasons of passing and receiving credit, but because students use grades as a reflection of themselves and as validation that they are doing something right. One student expressed that he cared about his grades because he wanted to make his family proud and because he invested time and effort on the class assignment. This is something important to keep in mind because what happens when students see an F? What does that tell them about themselves? And how will that impact their engagement? Does this mean that I implemented culturally responsive components in my class in vain? Absolutely not. In this same end of year survey, students had the opportunity to share more about their experiences in class. Only a few of them really talked about the grades, even though all of these responses you see in front of you come from students who ranked grades as being the most important factor in class for them. Some responses talked about SEL and opportunities to engage with other students. So whether we realized it or not, they were placing value into these different categories. All right, and so that brings me to my policy recommendations. To keep it simple, we have to find the space and time to allow students to participate in culturally responsive classrooms and projects. And for that, we need to allow teachers the time and resources to transform their curriculum. At a national level, we need to focus on improving the experiences of diverse students and teachers by having these voices heard in when it comes to changing policies or reviewing standards and curriculums. And so my message to all of you educators out there is to try to invite student voices in your classes and create meaningful experiences to them, because when they don't feel welcome, they are less likely to grow. All right, many thanks to all of you for being here today, and I'm happy to hear any of your questions.
Andrea, thank you so much. You hear people unmuting to clap for you. Anybody, you can always unmute to clap and to scream. That is totally welcome here in this space.
Yay!
Give presenters some love. And thank you for sharing with such openness the kind of full story of your year and the places where you're like, this is what I expected, this is what happened. I think all teachers can recognize that, like, oh, you care about your grade a lot. But still really, really powerful stuff that was happening in your space. Please head over to the chat to give Andrea some kudos, as well as any questions and feedback. Sarah has shared the link to the feedback form for her. And while you're over there, feel free to put any questions into the chat that you'd like. Or I realized that not everyone lives on Zoom as much as some of us do. So if you'd like to use the raise your hand function, if you go down to the reactions, it has a little emoji in the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, there is a raise hand function as well. So what questions or comments do you have for Andrea at this time? Thank you, Allison, for raising your hand. Go ahead and unmute.
I am an assistant principal at Farragut. I want to congratulate Ms. Polito on this incredible work. We are so incredibly proud and lucky and blessed to have you. Of course, as an administrator, I would say, how can we bring your findings to the freshman team? Because I think this is really, really valuable. And it's just really great work. And thank you for doing it.
Thanks, Estelle. I appreciate your kind words. And yeah, I think that I am more than willing to share this presentation with the freshman team. But with the freshman team, as you know, we've also been collaborating with cross-curricular projects. So the Model UN, which I did not present, was actually a cross-curriculum project that our freshmen were working on. And we are actually working on a PSA project as we speak, public service announcement project, where students are working in their world studies, math, biology, and English classes to create a video of any topic or theme of their choosing and share it out to create change. And so they are also given that power of activism in our classrooms. And so we're really excited to see the outcomes of that.
Maybe that's something we can hear a teacher talking about in the next policy forum next year. What other questions do you have for Andrea, or any comments that you'd like to share with the group?
I have a question. Cynthia Nambo here. I'd like to know, did you see any kind of differences in terms of how students engaged, students that were Black versus those students that were Latinx?
That's a great question. So I saw that the major differences came with the graphic organizers. So I saw that a lot more of our Latino students really focus on the graphic organizers and really use that to help support, create their end project. And so oftentimes our Black students were more interested in just getting the project done and like the creative aspect of that, and maybe not so much the content, even though the content knowledge was there, but just the fact of writing it down. Like they could verbally tell me without a problem, but just writing it down and like pressing that submit button in the Google Classroom. So that was something really interesting to see. And then also something that I was keeping in mind as I did other projects, because if the knowledge is there, I want students' grade to reflect that, right? Just because they didn't submit a paper, that doesn't mean that the knowledge is not there. So thank you for that question.
Another question from the audience that I think looms in everyone's mind as we sit in virtual presentations at the end of a virtual year was, how much do you think that pandemic-related issues impacted student responses, both in class and on assignments?
it was definitely difficult to get students to engage online. So that is where a lot of the scaffolding came in, and also the differentiation of reaching out. So I did have to try to reach students in different ways. So oftentimes I use Remind, which is like a messaging platform for students and teachers and parents. And so I really had to take a lot more action in terms of trying to reach students that I normally would in person. In person, I would have them in front of me for 15 minutes, so I would convince them sooner versus later. And so this required a lot of more steps. And so I needed to be I just really had to be aware of that in terms of like my timing and making sure that I was able to identify students who were maybe not starting the project sooner versus later, because when it was later in the projects, then it would make it more challenging for them to re-engage.
Thank you. And we have a final question from Danielle. Danielle, go ahead and unmute yourself.
All right. Again, I agree. I think you did a fabulous job. I was curious about you talked about the 10 students that you focused on, and I know that you were very diligent in taking data on for them and how they experienced it. But did you happen to get a sense of how your other students may have experienced it, or were they also a part of some of those changes that you were applying?
Yeah, great question, Danielle. Thank you. So I definitely did use some of the same supports that I used with these 10 students with other students. I did extend that support to them. However, I was not always monitoring perhaps the outcome as much, just for the sake of my data here that I presented today, but I was using those same supports. And I was actually also giving all my students the surveys generally, because I wanted to see general trends in my classrooms overall.
Let's give Andrea another round of applause, kudos, however you want to celebrate her. Thank you so much. And in closing, I need to raise the comment of Valerie Tatum. She pointed out the importance of agency and identity and authority in our children, and how that really came out in your project. And I think that really speaks to both of the first two presenters of the evening, how we can use and understand the voices and choices and experiences and identity of our young people as a way to bridge content for them. These were science teachers who are talking about this in the science class. And this really is at the forefront of the next presentation that we are going to be hearing from. Our next presenter, Alyssa Rabin, focuses on the authority, agency, and voices of students to help make a teacher better at what they do. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our third presenter of the evening, Alyssa Rabin. Take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Oh. That wasn't what I wanted. There we go. All right. So thank you all so much for being here this evening. My name is Alyssa Rabin, and my presentation is entitled, "If You Listen, They Will Talk, The Transformative Potential of Student Co-Generative Dialogues." I'm a 9th grade English teacher at Rauner College Prep, one of the campuses of the Noble Network. We are located in Westtown, but because we are a charter school, my students live all over the city of Chicago. We serve about 660 students, and I teach 3 classes of 9th grade English. We meet every day. While the Noble Network is doing a lot of intentional work to become an anti-racist organization, we historically have operated with practices that didn't always invite a lot of student input and autonomy. Since my earliest days of adopting the title of teacher, I've wondered at the authority that that title confers upon me, particularly as a white woman who grew up in a upper middle class family and community. I've spent much of my professional life dedicated to examining the shortcomings of our education system, unlearning what education should look like, and trying to reimagine a schooling that's affirming and liberatory for all. And this research is another attempt at doing that. So my research question was, how does the implementation of cogenerative dialogues between students and the teacher advance student ownership and autonomy in a high school English classroom? I had 2 sub-questions, which included what happens to students' confidence in their participation and their ability to complete coursework when I implement cogenerative dialogues, and how do cogen meetings change my work as a teacher? So your first question is probably, what is a cogen? It's a conversation ultimately between small groups of students and the teacher with a goal of gaining information and direct feedback from students about the classroom and instruction. It's about reducing the gap between teacher and student so that teachers and students are learning from each other. It's about sharing power. This cogen session that we're going to listen to in just a second took place in February. Melania and Rebecca are talking about a previous intervention we had tried in class in order to engage more students and new ideas of how to increase class engagement. I'm hoping the sound is going to work. If it doesn't, let me know. We're going to go ahead and take a listen to them.
Well, I feel like more people did Would You Rather than the camera, like turning on camera.
You think we should replace it with?
Yeah, turning on camera instead of the I'm sorry, were you gonna say something, Rebecca?
Yeah, I like what Sam's idea, because a lot of people have places that they don't like. Let's say their room, people don't like having their cameras on, and if we do that, that'll be easier and faster because it'll kind of take long, but this one will be quick, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Because not a lot of people turn on their cameras, and if they do, then it's really rare.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I say we change that one to Two Truths and a Lie.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and we do one day we do Kahoot or Would You Rather, and then the next day we do Two Truths and a Lie. I feel like...
Second, sorry, there we go. So over the course of the school year, I gathered data in a variety of ways, including focus groups, which were the cogenerative dialogues themselves, surveys that were given periodically both to my entire class and also to my students in cogen specifically. I also was recording my own sort of experience of class and cogen weekly throughout the year in my teacher journal. And I also looked at participation data, which included students contributing to class in the Zoom chat or by unmuting to talk, read out loud, or ask questions. So first we'll take a look at the data about the student experience of cogens. This is one of my 9th graders. We're going to call her Sandra. She participated in cogen consistently each week throughout the year, and she recorded this reflection video in May.
So cogen has, I feel like it's made class a lot more interesting and funner than how class started in the beginning of the year. I feel like people didn't participate as much as they did in the beginning of the year. I feel like at the beginning of the year, nobody really wants to participate. So when Miss Raven reached out to me for the coaching, I was really surprised because no teacher has actually asked me to help them with class. So that was pretty cool too. So I feel like that this has been a great impact to me because I feel like it makes class more interesting, and I feel like people do really enjoy class, even
Sandra mentioned that she had never had a teacher ask her to join the planning process before. I wondered how common that experience was, so I posed this question to all Rauner students. Has a teacher ever, from kindergarten until now, asked you to join a group to help them plan for their class? 65% of respondents, a majority, said they had not been asked to join their teachers in the planning process. Since my students specifically are in high school, this means that they've gone through 8 to 12 years of schooling without being asked for their input. While many students mentioned experiences such as student council or teachers giving them surveys to solicit feedback, most students have never been given the opportunity to offer ideas about their class and have significant input or autonomy over their class. Like many educators, my classroom changed overnight with the pandemic. The entirety of this school year has been conducted via Zoom, and I have never met most of my students face-to-face. Any educators here will likely be familiar with teaching to a screen of black boxes. While some students thrived in this environment, many others struggled, particularly to regularly engage in our class community and participate or complete coursework. It also posed a significant challenge to engage students in the cogen process, as it was asking them to spend even more time on Zoom. While I normally would be able to grab kids from the cafeteria to meet and build community by eating and chatting together during lunch, this was impossible in a virtual world, and it meant that the consistency and diversity of the group isn't what it might have been if we were in person. Ultimately, though, 6 students joined our cogen for varying amounts of time throughout the year. I'll introduce them and their words about their cogen experience. You'll notice that I use pseudonyms and include demographic information about each student. The intention of the cogen is for the group to be relatively diverse and representative, both racially and ethnically, as well as by gender and learner status. So the first student, we'll call her Mia. We saw Mia in action in the clip of the cogen earlier. She started off the year strong and typically turns in enough coursework to maintain at least a C or above. Although her attendance in class was spotty, especially in the second half of the year, she often participates when she is present. Mia noted, "I really like cogen. It feels like a safe place and it helps the class a lot." Next is Sandra, who we met in the reflection video. She's a Latinx female on a 504 plan. Sandra participated in cogen every week. Her participation in class also increased. She was consistent in turning in coursework throughout the year, and she said, "I feel like participating in cogen boosts me a lot and made me closer with Miss Raven." Next is Alexander. He's a Latinx male on a 504 plan. He's extremely gregarious, and while he participated in the chat in class from the start of the year, this has increased over time. He fairly consistently stays on top of his coursework, and he shared that cogen has made me want to participate a whole lot more. Next is Derek. Derek is a Latinx male. He turned in classwork occasionally, but initially did not participate in class at all. He's now a student I actually rely on as a leader in class, unmuting to read aloud and turning in his coursework with much greater consistency. Where he often had a C or lower earlier in the year, he now maintains an A average in my class. This was a private message that he sent me in the Zoom chat just before winter break. He said, "I've been enjoying school recently and you're one of the reasons. I wanted to say thank you and have a good break. Bye." This message was sent just after he joined cogen. Next is Brooklyn. She's a Latinx female on an IEP. We also heard her in the cogen video earlier. Brooklyn's participation in class has generally varied throughout the year. She stays on top of her coursework, and while she expressed a lot of excitement to be invited to join cogen, her schedule didn't really allow her to participate consistently. She noted that, "I like what I'm doing for our school." Finally, Oriah is a Black female on an IEP. Oriah was actually only in my class for semester 1 because of some logistical scheduling issues. She's a really bright student whose participation in class and work completion varied quite a bit throughout her time in my class. She also expressed a lot of excitement at being invited to join cogen, but both the schedule change and several obligations she had outside of school didn't really allow her to participate consistently. So one of the most exciting changes that I noticed after students began their participation in cogen was their class participation. The blue bars show participation in class for each cogen student labeled by their initial before they joined cogen. The red bars show participation in class for each cogen student after, during, and after their participation in the cogen group. Participation in our online context again meant unmuting to read out loud, to share an answer or ask a question, or commenting in the Zoom chat. For almost all CoGen students, participation seems to have greatly increased after they joined the CoGen group, though not for all. Derek's change in participation is most stark. He did not participate a single time until he joined CoGen, and he's now my go-to for reading out loud in class. The comments you see on the side come from a survey CoGen students took. They noted, "I have liked class a lot more because it feels like a safe place after participating in CoGen. I learned I can bring myself to talk in front of others, and CoGen has made me feel more comfortable to speak in class." I also looked specifically at the ways in which CoGen students were participating within the CoGen itself. I coded their comments in the following categories. A represents students making a new suggestion. B represents a student expressing agreement with another student or the teacher. C represents a student building on the ideas of another student or a teacher's suggestion. D represents instances of students reflecting or reporting back on the success of a class intervention they had suggested. And E represents students asking questions or posing a problem about the class. So the data you're seeing here is specifically for Sandra and Alexander, who participated most consistently in the group. As I took a step back to look at the data, I noticed that over time, students took on more of the responsibility of CoGen, speaking more. You can see that there are more comments in the later meetings over here than in the earlier ones. And proposing more ideas as opposed to simply agreeing with their peers. This shows me that consistent participation in the group also builds confidence and ownership over time. Of course, I was also curious about how the practice of weekly CoGen meetings would influence or change my work as a teacher. So just as I asked RCP students about their experience of being included in course planning, I also asked our teaching staff how comfortable they felt with inviting students into the process. Interestingly, 88.9% of respondents said they were either somewhat or very comfortable with including students in course planning. This data is particularly interesting taken together with the student data because teacher and student perceptions of involvement in course planning really don't match. When teachers filled out this survey, we had actually just completed a professional development session on student voice. And because we've talked a lot about student voice this school year, I believe teachers may have been a bit primed to feel that they should answer this question in a way that indicates that they're comfortable with including students. So I may or may not be an outlier amongst my colleagues, but I certainly have not always been comfortable with seeking student input. I'm a pretty type A person. I love to plan. I love to be really thoroughly planned. And seeking student input can be uncomfortable for many reasons, including giving up that control. I believe that this necessity for control is also a consequence of living within a culture of white supremacy. It was for this very reason that I embarked on this particular project. Rereading my teaching journal, I noticed that my comfort grew over time. Truly, the process was not actually as intimidating as I felt it was before starting, and I noticed that I actually came to rely on my students for their input and opinions. I said things like, I really enjoy getting to see and talk, or type as the case may be, with my CoGen students. I have found myself multiple times this week saying to other teachers, let me ask my CoGen students what they think about this. I told my supervisor that I would ask kids about the idea of students calling on each other during class, and I told my co-teachers I would ask them about our upcoming refresh week and what they felt was most helpful the last time we did that. I think I'm also feeling more comfortable generally seeking input from students, and as my co-planning teacher and I talked a bit about things we would continue into semester 2, stop doing and start doing, I really pulled on the feedback I've been receiving in my CoGen sessions. This is important because not only did I build a habit of regularly consulting my CoGen students when I had questions about how we should engage in something in class, but I also felt more comfortable soliciting feedback from students even outside of CoGen. Just as I analyzed how students contributed to our CoGen conversations, I also coded my participation. These included comments about directing the conversation, reporting back on implementation from a teacher's perspective, building on or confirming a student idea, asking for feedback on an idea, and asking students to direct the conversation. Here I noticed that at the beginning of CoGen, I still hadn't actually fully bought into the idea and intention of the intervention. I came to CoGen each week with an agenda and a specific list of items I wanted to talk about with students. This was me as the teacher still holding on to control, even within a structure that was meant to upend that. Partway through our meetings, I realized that I needed to put the cogens in the hands of my students. While I always have things on my mind to ask students about, I stopped making lists. I sat back and listened. I prompted students more often to tell me what they wanted to talk about, and I gave them time to think instead of automatically jumping in with my own questions and feedback. If I can take that lesson with me, to sit back and listen and allow them to fill the space and take the lead, I believe my classroom can transform for the better. So what's next? While I do believe cogens made my online class better this year and helped me to build relationships with students in the group, I really look forward to the opportunity to implement cogens in person next year. As I strive to continue to become an anti-racist educator, I look to folks like Dr. Christopher Emden and Paulo Freire for what liberatory education can be. Dr. Emden notes that students who populate urban schools are generally beholden to a pedagogy of poverty that rewards them for being docile and punishes them for being overly vocal or expressive. In response, and because they genuinely want to be successful in schools, many learn to repress their voices in order to not make any trouble. We must do all that we can to disrupt this. In a current education climate that talks a lot about culturally responsive teaching practices, I believe we must move beyond talk. Cogens are one strategy amongst many to implement a culturally relevant pedagogy. Our students must continue to, or our states must continue to write and implement culturally responsive teaching and leading standards, much as Illinois recently did, to ensure that pre-service teachers are prepared to affirm all of their students. Once teachers are in the classroom, we should offer them ongoing development and support in listening to their students and centering them within their classrooms. I imagine a future where cogens are a standard practice throughout schools and students have an active role in shaping all of their classes. Where cogens felt scary before I implemented them, I now cannot imagine teaching without them. Our young people are often discounted simply because they're teenagers. If you spend time with them though, and if you actually listen to them, you know that they have much wisdom to share. Thank you.
Yeah, you can hear the echoes of all of the clapping, and you've got some kudos in the chat already. Thank you so much, Alyssa. It is such a powerful statement about the opportunity that we have as teachers to learn from and alongside our students. I would like to invite everyone to fill out a feedback form for Alyssa. The link has just been provided by Sarah in the chat. And I have a question for you, Alyssa, now. Other people, if you are interested in adding questions into the chat, feel free. Or if you would like to use the reaction button in the bottom right to raise your hand, you may do that as well. So the first question for you is, was your ongoing teacher journal of the work that you did relatively predictive of students' perceptions and experiences, or did you find yourself surprised by their surveys, observations, comments during meetings, etc.? And this is from Erin Schlesman. My apologies if I mispronounced your last name.
It's a great question. I think what I would generally say is that typically when implementing something like this, where you're sort of directly asking students, well, what should we do? I think there's a tendency to think maybe they're going to ask me to do something crazy. Maybe they're going to suggest something that is, you know, for this, that, or the other reason not going to be feasible. And I just really didn't find that at all. Students, you know, were coming up with ideas of either things they'd experienced in other classes or variations on things we'd, you know, tried, things they'd done in the past that felt engaging to them. Really things that just felt like they made a lot of sense.
And a second question from Erin, what did communication with the whole class then look like after you'd made decisions driven by the cogen subgroup?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So actually a part of the original cogen model that comes from Dr. Christopher Emden is actually that it's meant to be sort of not a secret, but it's not meant to really be public. So I did not share with the rest of the class what students were involved, that we started playing Kahoots every Tuesday because cogen students said that we should. I didn't share any of that with the whole class However, I did have some students who very clearly picked up on those changes. When I gave quarterly surveys to the entire class, I did have a student actually remark, like, I've really seen an improvement in our class over time. Love the Kahoots. Like, great, then you know, the CoGen is doing exactly what it should, which is that we're making changes over time that students are noticing and, you know, benefiting from ultimately.
We heard about the Kahoots, and I think that there's interest from teachers in hearing about some of the topics that were discussed in the CoGens. Jody Horde, who is one of our prior ARLI alumni, asks if you could share a little bit more about those topics that you discussed. For example, did students ever get involved in the curriculum planning itself? Want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's a good question too. A lot of our conversation this year in particular centered on like student engagement, class engagement, participation. I think because there's such a focus on that in this particular year because of the nature of doing this virtually. And so a lot of the conversations we had in CoGen and a lot of the recommendations that they made had to do with sort of building class culture. That said, there were times when we also talked about curriculum. We talked about the movie sort of unit that we're doing now. We had talked about, I had sort of been checking in with them about some of the content we'd been having and how it was going over in terms of, we tend to focus on a lot of social issues in my class. And sometimes that can be really weighty, particularly in a year that was already quite weighty. And so that was a thing that we had talked about. So yeah, I mean, our conversations really ran the gamut. I do think like something that I've thought a lot about in carrying this forward in future years is handing over even more of the sort of power, for lack of a better word, to students to choose actually, what particular perhaps texts we look at or topics we look at as well.
Thank you. And a final question. You've just shared one thing that you're thinking you might change in the future as you put more of the power into the student hands around this. This question goes back to how you were talking about it being like kind of a quote unquote quiet secret, what the CoGen is and who's in it. What are you thinking about that now, that kind of official stance on CoGens being these kind of a secret space? Would you do it differently next year? Would you consider recruiting or seeing who applies to be in these co-generative dialogues?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This will be a little bit easier when we're in person. But I think something that I tried doing sort of at the end of the year that seemed to be helpful is that I had students actually say who else they thought would be a good addition to our group. And they asked those students to join as opposed to me asking those students to join. And I think that's, again, just another way of putting that power into students' hands and saying, this is your group. Who do you think should be here? I will say one reason that I was hesitant about that, particularly in the beginning, was again, because I wanted to make sure that the students who were included were diverse in many aspects. And so that's something that I would continue to keep an eye on. But I do think, instead of me sort of picking people who I thought might be a good addition because of, whatever aspect, definitely leaving that in the hands of the kids and letting them continue to invite people into the group is something that I would definitely do in the future.
Well, thank you, Alyssa. I know I can speak for a lot of teachers in the space when I say that this is inspirational to think about how we can invite students to help us make classrooms better spaces for us as we return to classroom spaces in the coming year. You might have noticed that there was a bit of a theme to this evening. A final round of applause for Alyssa, please. A theme, I don't know if it was purposeful or not, is student voice. And students being able to be the ones who are leading what happens in the space. And our final presenter tonight is going to take that in the oldest children direction up to the eldest members of our high school and thinking about joy, and activism. I think joy is a word that maybe hasn't come up yet today, although I think it's definitely been alluded to in all three of our presentations thus far. And this particular presenter is also a second year ARLI member. I would like to introduce, it is my great pleasure to introduce our final presenter, Katie Hallerbach, who is our ARLI Senior Fellow this year.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. And shout out to my parents. This is their second ARLI policy forum as well. So Mike and Nancy Hallerbach, thanks for being here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Andy and Andrea and Alyssa, you all are a tough act to follow. So very excited though to be here tonight. So let me just make sure I have quite a few animations, which I'm hoping are gonna go okay. Can I just get a confirmation that, did the slide go forward? Okay, thanks, Kate. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Hallerbach. The title of my presentation is Reimagining High School Social Science, Centering Joy, Resistance, and Collective Action. This is my 10th year teaching social science at Lindblom Math and Science Academy. And around this time last year, I was wrapping up my first year of teaching ethnic and gender studies after many years of teaching mostly world history. Ethnic and gender studies is a junior-senior elective. And like most first years of teaching a new class, the curriculum last year felt like a bit of a patchwork. Based on feedback from students and my own reflections on the year, I was eager to reorganize and reimagine this class based on what worked and what didn't. This led me to the following research question. What happens when I reorganize my ethnic and gender studies course to center stories of joy, resistance, and collective action? Two texts that were particularly influential in developing this question were Dr. Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, and Christine Sleeter and Miguel Zavala's book, Transformative Ethnic Studies in Schools. Reading these books last summer and fall inspired me to reevaluate not only what was included in my curriculum, but what was centered. I wanted to ensure that my students would be able to not just critique the roots of injustice in our society, but to find and share inspiration for how to engage in resistance and enact social change. This reimagining and recentering felt especially urgent in this moment. I wanted to do what I could to ensure that my students had opportunities to feel agency, joy, and community. To examine the impact of these curricular changes and to discover what my students found most meaningful, I examined the following data sources: a pre-survey, 3 mid-course feedback forums, student discussions, and a post-survey and focus group. Slides are still moving forward, we're good? Okay, thanks. So I had 27 students in my class this year, and their racial and ethnic identities roughly reflected those of the student body as a whole, meaning about 70% of them identify as Black and the other 30% identify as Hispanic or Latinx. Another important piece of context is that this year we had an altered schedule to accommodate the challenges of the pandemic and remote learning. So this class met on a block schedule during our second semester, which means I saw my students every day for 100 minutes from February through May. It also means I had the pleasure of teaching 25 second semester seniors at 8 a.m., which was a particular challenge as well. On the pre-survey at the beginning of the course, I asked my students what they wanted to learn about, and also this question about their experiences with remote learning so far. These were some of the responses I received. I had previously taught some of these students during their 10th grade year, but I was meeting many of them for the first time, and I was so humbled by their vulnerability and their willingness to share their challenges and struggles with me. Reading their responses was also a powerful reminder to me that unless I was responsive to the fact that students were feeling overwhelmed, depressed, and just trying to get this year over with, the curriculum I had been so carefully planning would not have any meaning. Checking in with students in a variety of ways became a common practice in this class that allowed me to not only be responsive to what students needed, but also make key adjustments to the course structure and content. This was the first of many meaningful takeaways from this project. In order to better understand their initial perspectives related to my research question, I also asked students to respond to 6 statements on the pre-survey on a scale from 1, strongly disagree, to 4, strongly agree. Here are the averages for each statement. Students overall felt pretty confident in their abilities to understand root causes of injustice analyze systems of power, and create change in their communities. These were wonderful assets that I wanted to build upon. However, I was also struck by the 3 statements with lower ratings and wanted to ensure that this class was also a space for them to learn about topics that empower their identities, learn about collective action and resistance, and perhaps most urgently, considering the very low average for this statement, experience joy and healing. This led me to refine the course outline I had initially created to spend a bit more time on our 2nd and 4th units, which were focused on identity and resistance, and a bit less time on our 3rd unit, which focused on analyzing systems of power and oppression. The essential questions evolved as the semester went on. I continued to ask for student input on what they wanted to learn, and in some cases, what they did not want to learn, and made adjustments as needed. Although I was initially focused on understanding the impact of the content I was centering, I ended up also learning quite a bit about the importance of the spaces and community we were creating as well. The findings I share with you tonight will shed light on both of these aspects. To understand what students found most meaningful from our class, I included a section on the post survey that asked students to rate 16 class materials and activities with one of the following: loved it, liked it, leave it, and I don't remember this. Here are the top 6 class activities and materials. These are the ones that no students indicated leave it or I don't remember this, and also had the highest number of students rating it as loved it. 4 of these 6, the ones circled in orange, were specifically related to course content. While this data is a good starting point, I should also note that unfortunately not all students completed the post survey. And by the end of the year, there were a handful of students who were not able to join class consistently due to work or family responsibilities. Therefore, to corroborate my findings, I'll highlight points of connection between this post-survey data and other data sources. My first significant finding was that students enjoyed reading texts and sharing stories related to identity. All students who took the end of the year survey either agreed or strongly agreed that this class provided opportunities for them to learn about topics that affirm and empower their identities, which was a big shift from the pre-survey, on which 40% of students indicated that they had not previously had such opportunities in school. To better understand which specific aspects resonated most with students during our 6-week unit on identity, I also analyzed data from the mid-course feedback forms, which students were invited to complete about every 2 to 3 weeks. During our 2nd unit, almost 60% of students who responded to the question about what they had enjoyed most about class recently mentioned something related to the readings, assignments, or class materials. This was much higher percentage than the feedback forms from other units, which suggests that students found these materials to be especially meaningful. Specific texts mentioned by students included poems from the Breakbeat Poets, Volume 4, Latinx, and an excerpt from George M. Johnson's memoir, All Boys Aren't Blue. In addition to enjoying reading and discussing materials related to identity, students also found it incredibly meaningful to tell their own stories at the end of the unit. For this project, students were invited to create a piece that expressed some aspect of their identity. The projects ranged in format from image collages to visual art pieces to spoken word performances, and several students mentioned this project as their favorite activity on the post survey. Here are 2 students' explanations for why. For many students, this project, and in particular the space to share their stories, was a source of joy, or as JB put it, it made him feel alive, proud, and comfortable all at once. MJ mentioned how it helped her get out emotions that she doesn't usually talk about. And I also want to mention, I found it interesting that this project had one of the highest submission rates of any assignment in the class, despite the fact that it was not for a grade. I'll admit that I have previously bought into the assumption that students are more likely to submit work if it impacts their grade, yet this data just proves this myth and also demonstrates that students are eager for opportunities to creatively express and celebrate their identities. I'll speak more about the long-term impact of this project on our class community a bit later on. Another significant finding related to content was that students developed a deeper understanding of resistance. Although about 75% of students indicated on the pre-survey that they had opportunities to learn about collective action and resistance in previous courses, this percentage increased on the post-survey, with 92% strongly agreeing that this class provided such opportunities. As I learned more about my students as the year went on, I realized that many of them had experience with activism and community work, while others were eager to learn more about how they might get more involved. So my goal for this unit shifted from focusing on methods of resistance, which I had initially planned, to exploring the connection between identity and resistance. We use the social change ecosystem framework created by writer and activist Deepa Iyer to explore the various roles that we can play to create change and also emphasize the power of working collectively. We also examined historical and current case studies of collective resistance and reflected on our own strengths related to social change movements. As this student mentioned here on the end of the year survey, this allowed for students to connect with the material on a deeper level and also start to see how they might contribute to causes they care about. So these first two findings, that students found it meaningful to learn about identity and resistance, are perhaps a bit intuitive considering these were the themes we had focused on most deeply. However, as I was analyzing students' discussion data, I started to notice that other factors or experiences beyond the content and stories that I was centering were also having a significant impact on students' experiences in the class. So returning to the most meaningful activities on the post survey, we see that students rated activities related to community building slightly higher than those explicitly related to content. And I'll admit, I initially spent much more time and energy planning the content of our course. But over time and through listening to students' input, I began to see that planning for these spaces, these opportunities for connection, was equally, if not more important. So here's an overview of what these 3 highest rated activities entailed. Song Significance was a community builder suggested by one of the students, MJ. This involved creating a class playlist and starting each class with space for a student to present a song that is meaningful to them. We listened to the song together and discuss how it made us feel. It's a lovely way to start the day. As previously mentioned, we also had an open mic for students to share their Tell Your Story projects, during which 16 of the 22 students who submitted a project volunteered to share. It's not required, they volunteered. Lastly, at the recommendation of 2 former students, I borrowed a tradition I had previously implemented in another class called Tea Time. Every Friday, the last 45 minutes of class were dedicated to a talking circle where students could check in about their stress, their joy, or anything else they wanted space to discuss. Here is a short clip from Dee, who participated in the end of the year focus group to explain the impact of these spaces from their perspective. And can you let me know if you all can hear? I hope the answer is yes.
As soon as we started this class, you gave us the opportunity to do something small to talk about ourselves, the song. When we started with Song Significance, it was something that didn't take up that much time, but it was still something that was like, oh, I get to if it was our day to present, it was like, oh, I get at least 5 minutes of this class to share something about myself, and it doesn't feel like, I'm listening all the time. Not that that's bad, but I feel like students oftentimes feel like they're not listened to because everything in school is so structured, and there's good things about there being structured, but there's also the fact that teachers can get so caught up in that oh, I have to get this lesson done, or I have to do this, but you're not listening to your students, you're not listening to what they need in order for them to learn, because it doesn't matter how much information you throw at us if we're not retaining it and if we're not putting it to use. So I feel like having that things such as Song Significance, and Miss Clark did something similar to where we had Turn Up Tuesdays and then Throwback Thursdays and stuff like that, where it just not only gave us an opportunity to speak about ourselves and start getting comfortable with baby steps in a class, but it also learning from our classmates, especially this year where we didn't I don't know what some of you guys look like, and it's just knowing what your favorite place to eat is, what your favorite fries are, things like that just make me feel closer to you, and it helps in discussions and when I'm giving you feedback and knowing your pronouns and all that stuff. So I feel like the fact that right off the bat you gave us that space, even if it was small, and then it obviously grew with the projects that you gave us, with the open mics and stuff, but starting off with something small like that, just it makes a bigger impact than you think it does, to us students at least.
So this focus group, and Dee's comment in particular, was an aha moment for me in understanding a trend I had noticed in students' discussions. Despite a few students mentioning how awkward online discussions were at the beginning of the year, students were making personal connections to the content and vulnerably sharing their own stories and experiences with each other in these spaces. Over the course of the semester, students engaged in 4 formal and graded discussions on various topics. These were conducted in groups of 5 to 8 students and recorded over Google Meets. Each discussion lasted from about 35 to 50 minutes. When coding participation for the fourth and final discussion, which occurred at the end of our unit on resistance, I had hoped to see frequent references to the case studies and readings, which I had so carefully selected. This to me would suggest high levels of student engagement as a result of our focus on stories of resistance, collective action, and social change. Yet what I found was a bit more complex. Across the 4 groups, evidence from these class materials were mentioned 19 times. On the other hand, students referenced personal connections or experiences related to the content of the unit 30 times. This included stories of students engaging in activism, having difficult conversations with family members, or reflecting on the emotional toll that this past year has had on them and their communities. And as this student mentioned on her post-discussion reflection, students sharing their own stories of resistance and making personal connections to the content made these discussions even more meaningful. She also mentioned that a safe space had been created to do so. This was a theme I noticed across multiple students' discussion reflections in terms of what best helped their understanding of the discussion topics. I believe that this was due to not only the purposeful selection of relevant content and readings, as this research was initially focused on, but also due to the authentic connections and trust that had been established in our class community. These opportunities to share personal connections were particularly powerful for students who entered this class unsure of the power of their voices. For example, JT disagreed with the statement, "I believe I have the power to create change in my community," on the pre-survey, yet shifted to strongly agree on the post-survey. She also mentioned that the most significant thing she learned as a result of this class was that she had good ideas about what's going on around her. Our class discussions provided space for her to feel empowered and validated by her peers and learn that what she says does matter. In addition to helping students deepen their understanding of the content and discover the power of their voices, these spaces for authentic connection also greatly contributed to our class becoming a space of joy and healing for students. On the pre-survey, 37% of students disagreed that school was a place of joy and healing for them, and another 22% strongly disagreed. This was certainly influenced by the challenges and traumas that my students were managing this year. And while many of that was outside of my locus of control, I hope that by centering content that was relevant to their identities and providing opportunities to connect, that our class might provide a bit of joy. For the students who completed the post-survey, this appeared to be the case. Student feedback on the post-survey, along with comments shared during the focus group, demonstrated that this was due to a combination of planned spaces like tea time, discussions, and our open mics, as well as unplanned spaces in response to events happening in our community, as TM mentioned here. I learned so much this year as a result of this research. Here are a few of my final reflections and recommendations. First, I plan to continue to refine my curriculum, and I'm grateful for the ideas shared by my students in our end of the year focus group. On that note, this research further confirmed my belief, and the belief of many others here tonight, that we have so much to learn from our students, and we have an obligation to make space for their voices in our planning and in our classrooms. And lastly, I want to remember something that a friend of mine told me when I was stressing over the planning of this project and class. She reminded me that I can't plan for everything, that sometimes magic happens in the accidental moments. She couldn't have been more right. I also believe that this research provides compelling evidence in support of the following policies. I found it incredibly meaningful to engage in a curriculum audit that helped me critically examine whose voices were missing and whose voices were centered in my curriculum, which then enabled me to reorganize around themes of joy and resistance. I also realized opportunities for me to adjust the phrasing of questions I asked students in order to emphasize individual and collective agency in the past and the present. I also hope that schools and school districts see the value in providing students with the opportunity to learn how race and gender shape our world. Offering ethnic studies courses or incorporating an ethnic studies framework into existing social science classes is one place to start. And lastly, as we emerge from this tumultuous year, I hope that we are cautious about returning to normal or making up for learning loss by diving back into content. This research shows that providing consistent opportunities for community building and connection enhanced students' learning of content. We must remember to plan as intentionally for these spaces as we do for our skills and assessments, because as Dee mentioned, it makes a bigger impact than you think it does. Thank you.
Please, everybody, feel free to give Katie some love. Thank you so much for sharing that really powerful study with us. Such important words from your students and your peers. We already have a comment in the chat from Valerie Tatum. If you want to take a look, she's recognizing that this is a really great structure to help our children understand and start having tools to synthesize systemic trauma. So thank you for that. Please, while you're in the chat, also click on the link from Sarah so that you can fill out a feedback form for Katie. She would love it, I know. She'd love to hear from you. As you can see here, she's interested in feedback. And what questions do you have for Katie at this time? You can either put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. We have a question from Jennifer Kobayashi. How do you think that block scheduling impacted this work versus standard scheduling?
Oh, great question. So at Limblin, we typically have a block schedule that meets twice a week. So typically I would see students on either Mondays and Thursdays or Tuesdays and Fridays for 100 minutes. But I will say, I do wonder, and I don't know if I had thought that until this question came up, whether seeing them every day for 100 minutes, which is quite a long time, how that might have contributed to the sense of connection that they had to each other and to the class. I think that's a great question and would be a great argument for block scheduling for sure. So thank you for that.
This is an opportunity for us to think about how we can do school differently, right?
Yes, not back to normal. Normal
right.
wasn't serving many of us, many students, so.
Absolutely. What other questions and comments do you have for Katie?
I just appreciate that y'all have stuck around till the end.
Well, I have a question.
Great.
So I love this quote from your colleague / friend, Molly.
Yes.
What was your favorite moment of magic?
Great, thank you, Kate. Great question. We had a little, well, I'll say this, our final tea time, which again, that's where we did like a virtual talking circle. And I kind of thought, you know, like projects were in, I kind of thought we were going to be like wrapping things up. The seniors finished a week or two ago. And, you know, I kind of thought, I was like, all right, well, that's all I have for us today. And they were like, let's stay on a little bit longer. And then just wanted to stay on the Google Meet for another 30 minutes that we had left in class. And so that was kind of nice. And they just were chatting with each other about, you know, their excitement for activities coming up. We planned a little picnic. We had a little, because they wanted to see what each other looked like. I was like, you all know that you could turn your cameras on to accomplish that as well. But we had a little socially distant picnic today at the park by school. So things like that. And just getting to hear, like meet their pets from time to time and just learn more about who they are. So probably that. Good question, Kate.
Thank you. We are now going to engage in something that those of you who have not taught this year may not have practiced, but it's the super extended wait time, in case anyone has a final question before we end the evening. One of my personal mentors and an early ARLI fellow said that she would spell hippopotamus very slowly in her head. And I feel like in this situation, one has to do it twice. But thank you so much, Katie. 2 times. Wonderful to hear from you both times, and both times virtually, a virtual virtuoso. I'm going to ask you one more question from Sue. So Sue was our ARLI advisor last year, and Sue knows Katie. And Sue asked, Sue, you could ask your question out loud. Would you like to?
Yeah, I'd love to. Katie, I was just so happy to see you including joy in your curriculum, but I wondered if there was any, and obviously it was an outcome, and some of the outcome was through the personal connection that they made and the chance to tell stories, etc. But were there any good sources that you used for joy in your teaching? How did you actually teach it? I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I'll be honest, this is something I struggled with, as Deb and others know, this year, and my, my group, like, is joy the outcome I'm looking for, or how is it centered in my class? So in Dr. Love's book, she talks about joy as resistance. And so, like, that was one concept that I really clung to. And so when we talked about, for example, like ACT UP and AIDS activism, and like this, just this idea of like existing as your truest self and finding joy in that, and that being an act of resistance, is something that we talked about a bit. I also think that in selecting the pieces that we read for the identity unit, making sure that the stories and poems and other sources that we looked at showed like all types of emotions related to identity, including quite a few that explicitly showed like just like the joy and pride and that you have in expressing your identity. And that then came through in their projects, I think, because sometimes I think well, I don't know, I guess a lot of the poems and whatnot that I had been familiar with were maybe a little bit more focused on some of the like the struggles, or I don't know, just like that aspect of identity. And so just really being mindful that like joy was kind of present in everything from tea time every Friday to like the structure of the class to also like the stories that we were consuming. Good. I don't know that that's like the best answer I can give right now.
No,
so it'll continue into next year, but that's it was something that I struggled with, but that's how I would answer it at this point.
Yeah, fascinating question, and that's why I asked it. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Deb.
Well, I'm going to close the evening out. I want to remember to thank Katie, who also stepped up numerous times during the course of the year to help out and work with the fellows. And I remember a particularly helpful time when she did a little mini lesson on coding data, and that turned out to be really very helpful to everybody else, newbie researchers. I mean, I guess as I've listened to these are studies that I've become pretty familiar with. I'm struck by a couple of things, and one is that one of the most important messages, I think, is to recognize that culturally relevant teaching doesn't mean you have to be an expert in African American history or Latinx history or any of that kind of stuff that people can go to school for years for. It also means treating your kids the way they want to be treated, with respect and all the stuff you've heard tonight, listening to them, hearing their voices, taking their experiences into account, treating them the way that they want to be treated. That's culturally responsive, which I think a lot of teachers, particularly probably a lot of white teachers, don't understand and don't recognize. So it's something that you can do a lot more easily than you might think. And again, part of that is that respect for kids. As the mom of two daughters who graduated from CPS, I'm well aware that they were very clued into which teachers talk the talk about being respectful and those teachers that walk the walk. And so what I'm so proud of you guys tonight for is how much you demonstrated that you really walk the walk in your classrooms. And just watching your faces, 3 of you had your students talking. Watching your faces as you were listening to your students talking was just touched my heart. And Andy, you didn't have audio of your kids, but when you were showing the pictures and how they personalized what they did, and the Pikachu and somebody's cat and that kind of thing, and you were talking about how they could share what was going on with them and they'd be there for each other. That's the side effect that isn't always obvious, how good that makes you feel as a teacher. I'm sure those were days when you thought, I'm glad to be here. It's all the other stuff. This makes it worth it. So the payoff is there for you as well. And I just want to remind everybody of that. So proud of everybody. You made it. You just got to finish that paper. And we will look forward to seeing the rest of you next week to share your research with. And you'll come back, huh, Sue? How was it? Okay. So thank you all for being here for us tonight. Appreciate it. And I don't know how do we, you know, it's like the end of the Academy Awards this year when the expected actor didn't win. How do we?
We just clap and we wave.
Clap and say, have a wonderful evening.
Hopefully
Hope it gets a little bit cooler.
Wonderful work, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Night, everybody.